When I was a kid, one of my heroes was a guy named Bob Riggle, because he had a car that could do something nobody else's car could do.
Somewhere behind an unmarked building in Burbank, California, sits one of the largest privately owned car collections on the planet, and almost nobody who watches Jay Leno's videos has actually seen all of it. Over 180 vehicles are packed inside that space, and while the cameras love to linger on the obvious stars, the McLarens, the vintage Duesenbergs, the roaring muscle cars, there's a second layer to this garage that almost never gets the spotlight. These are the machines mechanics whisper about, the ones car historians get excited over, and the ones that make you stop and ask, wait, that's real? Today we are going deep into that second layer, the part of Jay Leno's world that quietly left people speechless the first time they actually understood what they were looking at. Before we get into it, it helps to understand who Jay Leno actually is when the cameras stop rolling on late-night television. Most people know him as a comedian and a longtime talk show host, but inside the car world, he is treated less like a celebrity and more like a serious collector and a hands-on mechanic. He does not just own these cars, he studies them, restores them, and in many cases drives them on public roads, which is unusual for a collection of this size and value. Most museums keep rare vehicles roped off behind glass. Leno starts the engines. That single detail is why his garage has become such a magnet for car enthusiasts, and why the stranger pieces of his collection deserve just as much attention as the famous ones. Let's start with the car that sounds like nothing else on earth. Picture standing in a quiet garage and hearing a low whine slowly build into something closer to a jet preparing for takeoff. That is not a sound effect. That is the engine note of a genuine jet turbine car, one of the rarest surviving vehicles from an experiment that automakers eventually walked away from entirely. In the early 1960s, one major American manufacturer decided to test whether a turbine engine, the same basic technology used in aircraft, could realistically replace the piston engine in an everyday car. Instead of just building prototypes and testing them internally, the company handed a small fleet of these turbine-powered cars to regular families across the country and asked them to drive them like normal cars for months at a time, just to see what would happen. The results were surprising. Drivers generally loved the experience. The turbine ran smoother than a traditional engine, needed far less routine maintenance, and could technically run on a strange variety of fuels. But the economics never worked out. Producing these cars was expensive. Importing certain components added extra cost, and turbine engines simply were not efficient enough for daily use once fuel prices became a serious concern. So the company made a decision that still frustrates collectors today. Once the test program wrapped up, the vast majority of these turbine cars were deliberately destroyed. Only a small handful were spared, tucked away in museums, or handed to a few fortunate individuals. Today, only a handful of running, drivable examples are believed to still exist anywhere in the world, and one of them lives in Jay Leno's garage. Leno's connection to this particular car goes back decades, long before he ever had the means to own one. As a teenager, he reportedly saw one of these turbine cars on display and became fascinated by the sound and the idea behind it, never imagining he would eventually own one himself. Years later, once he finally acquired an example, keeping it running became its own adventure. Parts for a jet turbine engine built more than half a century ago are not something you can order from a catalog. When his engine eventually needed serious repair work, Leno had to track down specialists connected to the original engineering team, people who had actually worked on these turbines when they were new, just to bring the engine back to life. That is not typical car ownership. That is closer to aerospace archaeology. Now let's talk about a car that hides in plain sight for a completely different reason. Instead of standing out, this next vehicle was built specifically to look boring. Imagine a small, forgettable economy hatchback from the 1980s, the kind of car nobody would look at twice in a parking lot. Now imagine that same humble little shell secretly hiding a high-performance V6 engine, mounted behind the driver instead of up front, sending power to the rear wheels the way a proper sports car would. That combination sounds almost fictional, but a very small, very obscure American company actually built cars exactly like this, in extremely limited numbers, as a kind of underground performance experiment. The idea came from a pair of engineers with serious racing backgrounds who wanted to prove that a cheap, ordinary-looking economy car could be transformed into something genuinely fast without anyone suspecting a thing. They pulled the factory engine out, engineered a mid-engine layout, and dropped in a much more powerful engine borrowed from a completely different vehicle platform. The finished product could out-accelerate several genuine sports cars from the same era, all while looking like something a rental agency would hand out without a second thought, because building each one required so much custom fabrication. Only a tiny number were ever completed, likely fewer than 10 in total. Leno owns one of the earliest surviving examples, and by most accounts it remains one of the most deceptive sleeper cars in his entire collection. It still has factory air conditioning. It still looks completely unremarkable from the outside, and it can reportedly embarrass cars, costing several times more. From there, the collection gets even stranger, moving away from traditional cars entirely and into something closer to rolling sculpture. There's a small, independent designer who has built a relationship with Leno over many years, known for creating vehicles that barely resemble anything else on the road. Rather than starting from a car, this designer sometimes starts from a scooter, stripping away the factory plastic bodywork entirely and replacing it with hand-formed aluminum panels shaped like something out of a 1930s science fiction illustration. The result looks like a bullet, or maybe a tiny rocket ship, gliding along the pavement. These are not mass-produced machines. Only a handful were ever made, each one essentially built by hand in a small workshop, and Leno reportedly owns more than one of these early examples, simply because nothing else quite like them exists anywhere in the world. This is where the collection starts to reveal a pattern. It is not just about horsepower or top speed. Leno seems drawn to machines that represent an idea nobody else was brave enough or foolish enough to fully commit to, whether that idea came from a giant corporation or a single craftsman working alone. That pattern becomes even more obvious once you look at the collection's forgotten car brands. Buried among the famous names sits a coupe from a manufacturer that most people, even serious car fans, would not recognize if you said the name out loud. The story behind it involves a wealthy businessman who became obsessed with the idea of winning one of the world's most prestigious endurance races using an American-built car and an American driver. When racing officials changed the rules and required him to build a minimum number of road-legal cars just to qualify as a manufacturer, he did not walk away from the challenge. He built an entire small car company from scratch, just to make his racing dream possible. The cars that came out of this effort were genuinely impressive for their time, combining a powerful American engine with hand-built European coachwork. Production numbers stayed incredibly small, likely under 30 examples total, and the company never had the marketing power or financial backing to survive long-term, even though the racing team achieved respectable results on the track, finishing near the top at one of the world's toughest endurance events more than once. The brand eventually faded into obscurity. Today, most people walk straight past a car like this without realizing it represents years of ambition, engineering, and heartbreak packed into a single vehicle. Leno keeps it not because it is the fastest or flashiest thing in his garage, but because it tells a story that almost nobody else remembers to tell. Speaking of stories nobody remembers, there is a second turbine-powered vehicle hiding in this collection, and it is arguably even stranger than the first. Decades after the original turbine car experiment quietly ended, the idea resurfaced, this time as a modern concept car built with help from a major automaker's advanced design studio. Starting from sketches drawn up in a matter of weeks, designers created a low, aggressive shape clearly inspired by fighter jets and open-wheel racing cars, then wrapped its shape around a genuine turbine engine, similar to the type used in certain helicopters. This concept car was designed to run primarily on biodiesel, with a small separate fuel source reserved just for starting the engine before switching over. On paper, this vehicle is capable of shockingly high top speeds, deep into supercar territory, but in practice it exists mostly as a rolling demonstration, a proof of concept rather than something intended for daily use. Fuel economy is almost a joke, with the car managing only a handful of miles per gallon, meaning it is more of a spectacle than a practical machine. Still, placing this modern turbine concept next to the original 1960s turbine car creates a fascinating conversation between two completely different eras of engineers, separated by decades, both chasing the exact same strange idea, and both ultimately treated as fascinating dead ends by the wider industry. Most fans watching Leno's videos remember the exotic supercars. Very few realize his garage quietly holds two separate attempts at putting a jet engine in a road-going vehicle, built worlds apart in time. The forgotten brands do not stop there. Deeper into the collection sits a car built by a man who was actually one of the earliest and most important employees at one of America's largest automakers, someone credited with real engineering breakthroughs in the early days of the automotive industry. After leaving that company as a wealthy man, he decided to build vehicles under his own name, powered by an unusually advanced engine designed for the era. His company only managed to produce a modest number of cars before eventually shutting down, and today only a small number are believed to still exist anywhere in the world. The example in Leno's garage reportedly spent years locked away and mostly forgotten before finally being rescued and carefully restored. There is also an early example of a rotary engine-powered car, built by a small European manufacturer years before rotary engines became more widely associated with the completely different, much more famous car brand. This particular manufacturer bet heavily on rotary technology, ran into serious mechanical reliability issues that plagued the entire lineup, and ultimately could not survive as an independent company, eventually being absorbed into a larger automotive group. And alongside it sits a British Grand Tourer from the 1960s, a car that paired a big, relaxed American engine with a lightweight European body and genuinely advanced suspension technology for its time, technology that sounds more like modern engineering than something from over half a century ago. Each of these brands eventually disappeared in one form or another. Leno's approach is the opposite. He starts the engines. He drives the turbine cars down real roads. He takes the disguised economy car sleeper out and lets it embarrass far more expensive machines. He preserves forgotten brands not by locking them away, but by keeping them mechanically alive, decade after decade. Even a car that technically should not exist in its current modified form gets driven like any other vehicle in his collection. So why does any of this matter, beyond simply being a fun list of rare cars? Because it reveals something important about how automotive history actually survives. It is easy to assume that famous, expensive, headline-grabbing supercars are automatically the most historically significant vehicles in any collection. But often, the machines that matter most are the ones nobody expected to matter at all. The failed experiments, the discontinued brands, the strange one-off prototypes, built by small teams, chasing an idea the rest of the industry eventually gave up on. Without collectors willing to preserve, understand, and actually operate these machines, an enormous amount of automotive history would simply vanish, remembered only in old photographs and dusty company records, rather than living, breathing, drivable machines. There is also something genuinely admirable